Hello everyone. My name is John Sierra and I am a Tolkien scholar. And today I'm going to do what I hope to be the first part of a series of videos is an idea that I came up with quite a while ago, where I would go on to the internet, whether it's YouTube or whatever, in this case it is YouTube, and look at some quizzes based off of the Lord of the Rings or Tolkien mythology in general, and go through them and sort of rank them. Now I'm not trying to do this in like a competitive fashion of like I know all the answers or whatever. These quizzes do tend to be rather on the easy side because they're not aimed at Tolkien scholars. They're aimed at everyday fans who might have read the book or might have seen the movies. A lot of times they are based off of the movies. Some of them claim to be very, very difficult, and a lot of times there's a lot of errors in them, believe it or not. A lot of times what they say is the right answer is not the right answer, or there may be multiple right answers, or maybe they spelled something wrong or something like that. So I'm going to go through a few quizzes here that are on YouTube and sort of take them and explain the answers and just sort of grade them on how good are they as quizzes. Give them a letter grade, with an A+ being this is the best quiz I've ever seen, and an F being, just a total failure. So we start here from Quiz Prime. Now, I'm pretty sure I've seen this one once a few years ago when I first came up with this idea. Well, a few years ago, about a year ago. The channel's not that old. It's only like a year and a half old. But let's go ahead and well, we're nearly at 2 years. Let's go ahead and see this one. It says Ultimate Lord of the Rings Quiz. Notice it doesn't say The Lord of the Rings. A lot of people leave off that first letter, the first word there. For hardcore J.R.R. Tolkien fans. And this is from 2024, and it says it's a hardcore, right here, hardcore Lord of the Rings quiz to test your knowledge on the famous Tolkien masterpiece. There's 40 questions, which is quite a lot. So let's I want to go full screen here, and let's take it.
In this video, you have to answer our Lord of the Rings quiz. There
I have to?
30 questions and 8 seconds to answer.
Okay, so just right off the bat, I'm not respecting any time limits. As soon as I see the question and I assume they're usually multiple choice, I will pause and explain what the answer is and why.
Hit the subscribe and let's start. What is the name of the hobbit who inherits the One Ring?
Okay, so here we have 3 choices: Pippin, Frodo Baggins, and Samwise Gamgee. The answer is Frodo Baggins. This is a very easy question. Out of these 3, the only one that never held the ring is Pippin. Frodo and Sam both held the ring. For Sam, it was a very brief period. Frodo is the only one that gains the ring through what you would call an inheritance. You might argue that Sam sort of thought he inherited the ring since he thought Frodo was dead and that he would have to take on the quest himself. But that's not really in the spirit of the question. What I find interesting is that we get full names for Frodo and Sam, even, Samwise and not the shortened Sam that he's usually called. But Pippin is just one name, and it's his nickname. It's not Peregrine Took. It's Pippin, so I find that to be rather curious. But yes, the answer is quite obviously Frodo. Starting off with an easy one, but that's okay. Even in a hardcore quiz, you want to start off with an easier one. Very good that they mentioned that they're cousins. Oftentimes he calls Bilbo uncle, Bilbo calls Frodo nephew, but that's not that different from when you have cousins once removed, which means that they're from different generations. Bilbo is quite a lot older than Frodo. They are first cousins once removed, and they are also second cousins once removed because there's multiple families entwined here.
Who is the king of Rohan?
Oh, this one's dirty. Okay, so the king of Rohan, we have 3 answers here: Eomer, Denethor, and Theoden. Denethor is the one that is obviously incorrect. He's not a king at all. He's a steward, a ruling steward of Gondor until his death in the Return of the King. However, both A and C are correct. When the story starts, Theoden is indeed the king of Rohan, but then in the Two Towers, in the Return of the King, he dies. He dies at the Battle of Pelennor Fields when he comes across the Witch King, who projects this aura of fear that affects his horse, and the horse throws him, and he lands on the ground, and the horse lands on him and crushes him, and he dies not too long after that. The Witch King also dies because of the actions of Éomer, Éowyn rather, and Merry, and then when Éomer does get there, and what happens is he points to Éomer, indicating that he is now the king. And there is even a line in The Return of the King that says, Theoden, king, is dead. Éomer, king, is on the field of battle. Éomer is the king of Rohan after Theoden. So what they really should have done is they should have included someone like Aragorn or someone else that was never a king of Rohan. The answer that they're probably looking for is Theoden, but if somebody said Éomer, they would be very correct as well.
Theoden.
It's Theoden.
What is the name of Gandalf's
not
horse?
Theoden. So Gandalf's horse is Shadowfax. He met Shadowfax shortly after escaping from Orthanc, which was the tower that Saruman had him trapped on the roof of. And then Gwaihir, the Lord of the Eagles, came by because Radagast the Brown had asked Gwaihir to check on Gandalf and Saruman, and he finds him on the roof, and he says, please take me away from here. And Gwaihir was like, I was coming here to get news, not a guy. I'm not going to bring you all the way back up to Eriador. And Gandalf says, you can drop me in Rohan, and I'll find a steed that will bring me to the north. And so he goes to Theoden, the king, who is under the thrall of Grima Wormtongue, who himself is working for Saruman. And he just sort of tries to get rid of Gandalf by stating, just take whatever horse you want. So, of course, Gandalf, being given permission by the king to take whatever horse he wanted, took the best horse in the stables there. Bill was a pony, not a horse. It was a pony owned by a man named Bill Ferny in Bree, and they bought him for an exorbitant price. Bill Ferny was essentially price gouging, asking for 12 silver pennies for this malnourished pony when apparently the price for that animal would be something like 3 silver pennies. And Frodo and Merry put their money together and bought him, and Sam named him Bill. He makes it through, by the way. He doesn't get eaten by wolves or the Watcher in the Water or anything like that. He makes his way back to Rivendell. Brago is not the name of a horse in The Lord of the Rings, but it is the name of a horse in the film versions. The horse that saved Aragorn after he had taken a tumble off of a cliff in the Two Towers. This is not a scene from the book at all. That was added for sort of the dramatic flair, and to make Éowyn sad because she thought he was dead, and to make Legolas and Gimli sad. But oh my, that was loud. I thought I had that muted. Let's just, yeah, okay, that's muted now. That was the system sound. Sometimes if I reboot, it goes back up instead of being muted like I prefer. So anyway, Brago in The Lord of the Rings in the book was the name of a king, actually a prince of Rohan that had ridden off to take the path of the dead, and Aragorn finds a skeleton at one point. But yeah, Shadowfax, you see a picture of him. The one thing that the Lord of the Rings films got wrong about Shadowfax is that he was not a white horse, he was a gray horse, and he may have even sailed to the west at the end of the story with Gandalf. They don't mention his name, but they do mention that Gandalf is there on top of a gray horse. No, I lost focus here.
Which race is known for living in the Misty Mountains?
So this is an interesting one. I would not the elves or the Ents. Elves tend to prefer forestry, not mountains. Ents obviously prefer forests because they are the shepherds of the trees. The dwarves live under the mountains, or I should say they lived under the mountains in a vast metropolis that they created in the First Age, and they called it Khazad-dûm, which essentially means the domain of the dwarves. And the elves gave it this sort of jokey nickname, Moria, which means the Black Pit. However, during The Lord of the Rings, none of the dwarves lived there. Balin had gone there with a company of dwarves, but they hadn't heard from him in a really long time. It turns out he had died, and they were all wiped out. The race that I would say is known for living in the Misty Mountains would be the orcs, the goblins. But the answer here, I'm sure they're looking for dwarves as the answer. They used to live there, and they will in the Fourth Age.
Spider that attacks Frodo in the third book?
I like this. Okay, so we have she does mention it's the third book. That's incorrect. That's incorrect. It was the third movie, The Return of the King. But the scene in which Shelob, and that is the answer, Shelob, appears is actually from The Two Towers, the second book. So that's the question itself is false, but that doesn't matter. What is the name of the spider? And what's interesting is that the spider really doesn't have a name. I talked about this in a video once, but is generally called Shelob, as in she, as in lady. Lob is this sort of archaic English word that means spider. So it's literally just Lady Spider. What's interesting is that when Tolkien was writing The Lord of the Rings, in the early drafts, he called the spider Ungoliant, which was a name from the Silmarillion, which essentially means gloom weaver, which was a word for a monstrous primal sort of force that had taken a spider shape and was responsible for the destruction of the two trees of Valinor, the darkening of the Undying Lands, along with Melkor. And Tolkien had the idea that, in writing the Silmarillion and mentioning that after her sort of tete-a-tete against Melkor, that she had gone into the south and sort of vanished from history, and there was an elvish myth that she may have consumed herself and died, and that the Lord of the Rings would reveal that she had been alive and she had been living in Mordor, or close to Mordor, in a place that became known as Cirith Ungol, which is literally Pass of the Spider. But anyway, he decided that Shelob would be the name and that it was Ungoliant's daughter. Balrog is interesting because that's also not a name. None of these are names. They're just descriptions. Balrog or Valorauco in Quenya. Balrog is Sindarin. They're both Elvish languages, and they both mean the same thing, powerful demon. But anyway, it's Shelob. Yeah.
Who led the army of the dead in the movie The Return of the King?
So obviously not Elrond, not Saruman. It was the King of the Dead, who's never actually given a name. The Army of the Dead are also known as the Oathbreakers, or the Dead Men of Dunharrow, and they were men from Dunharrow who pledged a sacred oath, capital O, oath, to the One, or known as Eru, or Iluvatar, essentially God, and pledged that they would assist the King of Gondor. In this case, it was Isildur. Although Isildur wasn't, he was the High King. Actually, he wasn't even the High King at this point. It's sort of interesting. Elendil was the High King, and his two sons were the Lesser Kings, Isildur of Arnor and Anarion of Gondor. But in this case, it was Isildur specifically that they pledged. He was a king, and he was in Gondor, but he was really the king of Arnor. But they pledged a sacred oath to assist him, and then they didn't do it. They just shirked their duties, and they did not go to war with the king against Sauron. And so they were denied the gift of man, because Iluvatar, who is God, does not like people essentially taking his name in vain and swearing false oaths, and he will hold you to the oaths that you make. And we see this with other characters like Feanor. So what happens is they die in the sense that their bodies die and they perish and their bodies wither, but their spirits are not allowed to pass from the world, which is the gift of man, that we could go elsewhere and depart from the world upon bodily death instead of lingering as wraiths. Usually a wraith is someone who has been anchored to the world through dark magic, like necromancy, but in this case it was that they were basically barred from leaving the world until they fulfilled their oath. In the book, Aragorn brings them to the Bay of Pelargir, and they sort of chase off the corsairs of Umbar. They cause them so much fear that they pitch themselves into the bay and they drown, and some of them are slain by Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas and the Dunedain that they had brought with them, including one of Aragorn's kin, as well as Elrond's sons, who are technically also his kin. And they dissipate because they fulfilled their oath. The movie made it a little different, where Aragorn actually brings them to the Battle of Pelennor Fields, and they actually fight in that battle, and then Aragorn specifically tells them that they are released, and then they dissipate. But Aragorn doesn't really have the authority to do that. He doesn't have that sort of power. It was actually God who let them dissipate, and it happened at the bay, not at the Battle of Pelennor Fields.
What is the name of the dangerous region the Fellowship travels through after leaving Rivendell?
Okay, so this is a mess. First of all, they're showing a photo of the movie where they're in Moria. So, I mean, you can see that they're not in a forest. You can just eliminate that right off the bat. And if you know a little bit about it, if you've seen the movie or read the book, then you know that Mordor is the eventual goal. It's not like right after they left Rivendell. So obviously, even if you forgot the name of Moria, there's a picture of them right at Balin's tomb, about to fight a bunch of orcs and a very angry troll. I would not say that this was right after leaving Rivendell. They do a lot of traveling before they get to there, and they did face danger. They faced danger in Holland. They faced danger at Caradhras, which is the Redhorn Pass. So I would not say this is like the first danger either. So it's sort of a weird question. Could have been worded better.
Mines of Moria, the underground kingdom of dwarves beneath the misty mountains. Who forges the One Ring in the fires of Mount Doom?
Okay, so it's interesting. This is a pretty well devised question, although it's very easy. I would hardly say this is for hardcore fans. We have 3 characters here who are all known somewhat for forging rings. Celebrimbor was one of the Elvish smiths that forged the rings of power, and he specifically forged the 3 rings, Nenya, Vilya, and Narya, that went to the 3 elves. Saruman did make a ring. We don't really know how powerful it was, but he made a ring, and of course Sauron made the One Ring. That is the correct answer.
It's Lord Sauron. What is the Elvish word for friend?
The Elvish word for friend is Melon, which appears on what you see there, the doors of Durin, which say speak, friend, and enter. Mithrandir is actually a word in Sindarin that means gray pilgrim, and it's how they refer to Gandalf. And Manwë is actually a Quenya name for the Lord of the World, the King of Arda, the head of the Valar, Manwë Sulimo, who sits upon a mountain called Taniquetil with his wife Varda, and he's sort of overseeing everything. He's sort of the head angel that God left in charge of the world, along with his wife Varda. So there you have it. So 2 characters, and one is the word for friend.
What is the name of the oldest Ent in Middle-earth?
Okay, so this is a weird question. I would say, first of all, Radagast is not an Ent, he's a wizard. Then we have Quickbeam and Treebeard, which are 2 names of 2 Ents that we meet in the 2 towers, and we know that Treebeard is older because he talks about the First Age, and he talks about walking around in Beleriand and such. We don't know that he is the oldest. He is almost certainly the oldest Ent that is still alive in this specific location in Fangorn Forest. It is possible that there are Ents in other forests throughout Middle-earth. Quickbeam, we do know that he is a younger Ent because Treebeard tells us that he's a younger Ent. I think it's likely that he's the oldest Ent in Fangorn Forest. It is named after him, after all. I wouldn't say that we know for sure he's the oldest Ent in all of Middle-earth. Middle-earth is a pretty big place, and there are a lot of places that they never visited in The Lord of the Rings.
Which of these characters does not carry the One Ring at any point in the story?
So it's Gimli. Gimli never carries the One Ring at any point in the story. Frodo, of course, carries it for the majority of the story, and as I mentioned earlier, there's a brief period where Sam does. In the movie version, Gimli tried to destroy the ring with his axe, which was a pretty amusing scene. As the axe sort of shatters everywhere, and it just shows, the type of character that he is, at least in the movies, that he's like, well, what are we waiting for? Let's get to it, and that he's sort of the comic relief character. The book version of Gimli would have known not to do such a thing because he would have figured they tried that already, and he was a lot quieter and more reserved in the book. So, there you have it. It's obviously Gimli is the answer.
That's Gimli, son of Gloin.
Good pronunciation on Gloin there.
The new steward of Gondor right after Denethor II's demise.
So the stewards of Gondor are really interesting because there was, of course, kings of Gondor, and they came up with the idea of having a steward, which was a distinguished title, usually of a man that is older than the king, that would sort of be his advisor and who would rule Gondor if the king was out and abroad, doing diplomatic works, or if he was out at war. And they actually were not dynastic, meaning that each king chose who the steward was going to be. And we don't know the names of the first stewards, but eventually they settled on one of the kings having a steward named Hurin of Aman Arnen. And Hurin, which is one of several characters in Tolkien's world named Hurin, he's not to be confused with the Hurin from The Lord of the Rings, or the Hurin from the story The Children of Hurin, which was from the First Age. This is an older Hurin, Hurin of Eren Amen. It's a little confusing because he had a son named Hurin, just like the Hurin Thalion from the First Age. So they like to name themselves after, older characters. But anyway, it became a tradition for the kings to choose stewards from Hurin's line, so it became sort of quasi-dynastic. Now, after the last king was gone and there were no viable heirs, they became the ruling stewards, and it officially became a dynasty where it would be passed on to the eldest son. And it was expected that after Denethor II would die, that Boromir would become the steward, but of course Boromir died. He predeceased his father, and so Faramir, the younger son, became the steward. And what is interesting is that Faramir, Aragorn is obviously wrong. Aragorn becomes the king. When Aragorn becomes the king, Faramir thought the office of steward would end, and that he was basically only steward for just a brief moment. But of course, Aragorn decided that they would just go back to being the stewards and not the ruling stewards, and Faramir also gained another title, the Prince of Ithilien, which is pretty cool, meaning that he had his own little part of Gondor, which was Ithilien, and that became his princedom, meaning that he basically was a lesser ruler of that region. That he didn't rule Gondor, but he ruled a specific part of Gondor. So there you have it. Faramir's the answer.
Who then gave the throne to Aragorn.
Could they have picked a better screenshot where his mouth isn't hanging over?
What is the name of the river that flows through LotH?
Okay, so this is interesting because whenever you ask, like, hey, what river, people usually point to the Anduin, because the Anduin is sort of the main river that flows from the north to the south, and a lot of the Fellowship's travels are sort of following the Anduin once they get there. But there are a lot of lesser rivers that are tributaries to the Anduin. Nimrodel is not a river. It's the name of an elf, so that one's straight out. The actual answer is Celebrant, which means the silver lode. That is the river that goes directly through Lothlorien. Incorrect accent on the O here, by the way. It shouldn't be a flat line. It should be a dash. It should be a diagonal accent.
What is the name of the dangerous pass that the Fellowship attempts to cross in the first movie?
So I mentioned this earlier, that before they went to Moria, they had gone through Holland, and they had attempted a pass known as Carithris. Now, Carithris is the name of it, but it's also called the Red Horn Pass. The Black Gate is the gate that goes into Mordor. The Fellowship doesn't quite make it there. Sam and and Frodo and Gollum go there briefly, and then they decide not to try that. The Pass of the Dead, that's also later on, and that's Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas, as well as some other characters that are not from the Fellowship.
What do the elves of Middle-earth use as their language?
Okay, this is interesting because we have 3 answers, all with 2 choices. Now, there are various Elvish tongues out there. There's not just one Elvish language. And we see the first one is Valinor and Eldamar. Now, Valinor and Eldamar are not languages. They're 2 countries in a place called the Undying Lands. And that's where Frodo and a bunch of other characters go at the end of the book. The correct answer is Quenya and Sindarin. Now, Quenya is derived from the first language that the elves spoke, which was called Primitive Quendian. And the elves, they were called the Eldar, but they called themselves the Quendi because they were the first to speak with voices, or at least they thought they were the first beings to speak with voices, and Quendi in their language means the speakers. So Quenya as a language, it literally just means language. It means to speak. Sindarin is the language of the Sindar, which are some of the Teleran elves that did not quite make it to the Undying Lands. They started the journey, and then they didn't get there. Now, there are other elves that were Teleri that didn't get there, such as the Nandor and the Lyquendi and the Sylvan elves. But the Sindar were the ones that came up with a sort of divergent branch of Quendian. So basically, the languages are, Quenya is sort of the language of the Undying Lands, and Sindarin is sort of the language of Middle-earth. However, a lot of the elves that had gone there, particularly the Noldor, came back to Middle-earth as exiles, and so they spoke Quenya. Now, a lot of them learned Sindarin as well because they had to communicate, and King Ilúthingol of Doriath did not like Quenya, or rather he did not like the Noldor because of all the horrible things that they had done, and he banned the speaking of Quenya in his realm. But there are elves that speak Quenya. Interestingly, Sindarin is actually the official language in Gondor, but we see that Aragorn, for example, is fluent in both Sindarin and Quenya. Rivendell and Faerie are names of places. Rivendell is a Elvish realm, which is presided over by Lord Elrond, and Faerie is actually the Hobbit's name for the Undying Lands.
Who is the father of our elf protagonist?
Well, considering there is literally a picture of Thranduil here, the pictures sort of make it easier, you know. They should have had a picture of Legolas there, right? Elrond has children. He has 3 children. There are his twin sons, Eladana and Elrohir, and then, of course, there is Arwen. Isildur was not an elf. He had 4 children, 3 of whom died pretty early on in their lives. Unfortunately, the 4th one was his youngest, who became the king of Arnor. So Thranduil, he is the king of the Woodland Realm in Mirkwood, and his son is Legolas. We don't know if he has any other children. We don't know his wife's name or where she is during any of these stories. She could have been sitting next to him the whole time, and it was just never mentioned, or she could be in the Undying Lands. Who even knows? I sometimes make the joke that she could be in the wine cellar, you know, just throwing him back. But yeah, it's Thranduil.
Which creature does Samwise Gamgee defeat on his trip to Mordor?
So, yeah, technically 2 of these questions are correct. Actually, technically, they're all sort of correct. The Watcher in the Water was a giant squid-type creature that had appeared in the lake just outside of Moria, and it tried to eat Frodo, and Sam was the one that went rushing in, hacking at it with his sword, and freed Frodo, and then they all rushed into Moria. So I'd say that technically, you know, Sam kind of defeated the Watcher in the water. Very interesting, by the way, to see a different Watcher in the War of the Rohirrim eating a mumak, which is crazy. It really gives you the scale of how big they are in that sense. We only really ever get tentacles in the Lord of the Rings, so you know you don't get like a scale of how large they are. He technically did defeat Gollum, and he technically sort of defeated Shelob. The answer they're looking for is almost certainly Shelob, because in the picture, he's holding up the file of Earendil. Well, really the file of Galadriel that holds Earendil's light, and that he used to blind Shelob, and then he started stabbing at Shelob's eyes. And what happened in the movie and the book is a little differently, but in the book what happened was that Shelob was sort of tired of this tiny creature, blinding her and poking at her with a sword, and she knew that he was below her, so she decided to just crush him with her body weight. But what she did was she came down on the sword and basically, as the orcs put it, pinned herself. Now, in the book, the dynamic was a little bit different, because it was Frodo that was actually fighting Shelob initially, and losing, I should add, and Sam was actually fighting Gollum. So they sort of attacked together as a sort of a alliance of opportunity here. And after Sam got done beating up Gollum, he went to go assist Frodo, who was being wrapped up in the spider silk. And this is where, she tried to crush him and all that happened. But and then, of course, he thought Frodo was dead, and he took the ring. And then he found out Frodo wasn't dead, and he went and he rescued him. But yeah, technically all three of them are correct, but the answer they're looking for is almost certainly Shelob.
What is the name of the wizard who led the Council of the Wise?
So, for the most part, it was Saruman. Radagast was not the leader. What's interesting is that the Council of the Wise, which is really not the right name, it's actually the Council of the White, not the Council of the Wise. And the Council of the White, or the White Council, was actually created in the Second Age by Galadriel. And it was all elves initially, until the wizards came, and then they joined it. And Galadriel actually wished to cede her leadership to Gandalf. She deemed Gandalf to be the wisest of the wizards and wanted him to sit at the head of the council. Saruman was not happy about that. He wished to be the leader because he was the leader of the wizards, and it didn't make sense for him to sort of be Gandalf's boss in one sense and then have Gandalf as his boss in another sense, and also just his personality. He doesn't listen to other people all that well. So Saruman sort of insisted. Gandalf wasn't about to argue, since he didn't really want to be in charge of the council. I would say you could make an argument that Gandalf acted as the head of the White Council, as he was the White Wizard, and expelled Saruman both from the Order of Wizards and from the Council. However, the Council didn't really have meetings after this, so I would say, yeah, definitely Saruman. No issues there.
Which of these rings is not included in the 3 elven rings?
Well, see, now Nenya and Vilya are 2 of the quote-unquote elven rings. Nenya is the one that Círdan has. Círdan has. Nenya is the one that Galadriel has. Vilya is the one that Elrond has, that he got from Gil-galad. Narya was the one that Círdan had. He passed it on to Gandalf. Obviously, it's the One Ring, and I mean, just the name One Ring, that it's not part of the 3 or the 7 or the 9. It's one. It's singular. They should have had Nenya and Vilya, and then like something else that sounds like it could be in there. Not a very well constructed answer there.
What was the name of Frodo's elvish sword that Sam used to defeat Shelob?
Of course, it was Sting. The File of Galadriel, I mentioned earlier, it's not a sword, although it was used in the defeat of Shelob, as I mentioned there. It was Sting. Sting was a sword that was found in The Hobbit when the trolls had been disposed of by the sunlight, and then they found the cave where the trolls lived, and they took a bunch of the food, and they found some pretty fantastic blades that had come out of an old elvish city called Gondolin, which fell in the First Age. And 2 of the swords were very important. There was Glamdring, which wound up being Gandalf's sword, and there was Orcrist, which wound up being Thorin's sword. They didn't know the names of the swords then. Elrond examined them and told them what they were, and Glamdring was actually the sword of the king of Gondolin. His name was Turgon, and Orcrist was called the mate of Glamdring. It was probably used by a very important elf, most likely Ecthelion of the Fountain, although we don't know for sure. Sting was just a dagger that didn't have any particular name, but Bilbo later named it Sting after he used it to kill spiders in Mirkwood Forest, and he passed it on to Shelob. Anduril is actually the name of Aragorn's sword, which is not an Elvish sword. It was made by a dwarf named Telchar in the First Age, and it became known as the Blade of Elendil because Elendil, the High King, used it. So it was never really in the hands of elves. It was made by dwarves, and it was generally used by men. It was called Narsil originally, but it broke, and Elrond had it. He didn't use it because it was broken, but he had it with him, and he gave it to Aragorn when Aragorn sort of came of age. He turned 20 years old, and he gave him the sword, and then later in The Lord of the Rings, he reforged it, or had it reforged, I should say, and he renamed it Anduril, which is a poetic way of saying the flame of Numenor.
Which creature captures Merry and Pippin after the breaking of the Fellowship?
This one's dirty. No, this is bad. Oh no. Orcs and goblins are the same thing. So orc and goblin are two different names for the same creature. They're called a lot of different things. Orc is derived from the Elvish Irch, which is Quenya. In Black speech, they're called Urk, and there are a lot of other ways to refer to them in different languages. Most of them sound like orc. There is one, the Druidan language, that calls him Gorgun, which you might say in universes where goblin might have been derived from. It is mentioned in the very first part of The Hobbit, before the story even starts, in the foreword, that orcs and goblins are the same thing. Some people like to argue, oh no, the orcs are the larger kind. That's not actually true. It's mentioned that the larger kind of goblin are hobgoblins, but they're all orcs. They're all orcs and they're all goblins. Dwarves obviously didn't capture Merry and Pippin. So there were different types of orcs, and some of them were called Black Urks, some of them were called Uruk-hai, and those two kinds they weren't the only two kinds, because Aragorn had noted in the corpses left behind by Boromir that there were a lot of different types of orcs, and he said, well, these are Black Orcs from Mordor, and these guys are from the Misty Mountains, but these guys, and this is referring to the Uruk-hai, I don't really know them. They're new. I've never seen those guys before. So it was sort of a coalition of different orcs that captured Merry and Pippin. The answer they're probably looking for is A, but C is also correct.
They were orcs of Isengard.
They were orcs of Isengard, but there were also orcs of Mordor, or orcs of the Misty Mountains, and orcs of different places. So that's not really... No, that's a fail on question 21 here.
What is the name of the river that flows through the Shire?
Okay, so it's interesting because the answer here is actually the Brandywine River. The Great River is sort of just a colloquial term for the Anduin, but some people might mistakenly think that it's the same thing as the Brandywine because of the way the hobbits refer to the Brandywine as simply the water. The Entwash is more towards Rohan, and the Anduin is way out in the east. So yeah, it's definitely the Brandywine River.
The Brandywine. What does the writing on the One Ring mean?
So power, death, destruction would be fantastic. Hope, faith, love would be really hilarious if Sauron put that on the ring. No, it's one ring to rule them all. That's the part of the inscription on the One Ring. This isn't a very difficult question.
Gave to Aragorn.
Oh, okay, so we talked about this. Anduril is the sword. I mentioned Glamdring. I mentioned Orcrist. Technically speaking, when Aragorn was given the sword by Elrond, it was in two pieces, not a whole lot of shards like shown in the movie, and it was not called Anduril. It was called Narsil, which means red and white flame, because in the sunlight it shone with a red sort of color, and in the moonlight it shone with a white sort of color, and that's why it was given that name. It's actually Aragorn that reforges it, or has it reforged, and calls it Anduril. I'll give them a pass on this, but that's, yeah, it's really... Not Narsil, Narsil.
Which of these three main characters is older?
It's Nar, which is referring to the sun, Anor, and Sil is like Isildur, referring to the moon, the Ithil. Which of these characters is older than Frodo? Well, which of these three main characters is older? Frodo, Aragorn, and Gimli. So Gimli's the oldest here. Frodo, when these all meet in Rivendell. I mean, obviously Frodo and Aragorn, they meet in Bree, but then they don't meet Gimli till they reach Rivendell. Frodo is 50 years of age. Aragorn is 87 years of age, and Gimli is 139 years of age. And that's just by simple solar years. If we were to go by life years, as in who is the most experienced, who is the most mature, it is Aragorn, who he's 87, which kind of makes him middle-aged for a man of his lineage. I didn't need to wait there. So Galadriel is the Lady of Lothlorien. Éowyn, as far as we know, never went to Lothlorien, at least not in the story. It's possible that in the Fourth Age, her and her husband may have visited there. I'm sure that Faramir would have wanted to go there on some sort of diplomatic trek, although there was nobody living there at that time, so maybe not, because Galadriel had sailed to the west, and Celeborn had come to live in what used to be called Mirkwood Forest, which is now called the Forest of Green Leaves, and eventually he even stopped living there and started living in Rivendell. Arwen is a woman, not a lady as in the title with the capital L. She's a lady with a lowercase l. And she did live in Lothlorien for a great deal of her life, but she is not the lady. The reason that Galadriel is called the Lady of Lothlorien and not the Queen of Lothlorien is because Lothlorien had a king. His name was Amroth. Now, in the original version of the story that Tolkien was telling when he was just starting to write it, Amroth was actually Galadriel's son. And then it was decided that she did not have a son. She only had a daughter, Celebrian, who went on to marry Elrond. And that Amroth was a completely different character who was a king of Lothlorien who died in a tragic accident. He drowned in the Bay of Pelargir trying to reunite with his wife. Well, anyway, so the elves in Lothlorien were like, well, we don't have a king anymore, so how about you guys? Looking at you, Galadriel and Celeborn. And so because they didn't inherit the title of king and queen by blood, nor did they conquer the land and declare themselves to be the king and the queen, they were sort of just adopted, they decided to be called the Lord and the Lady. Some of the characters refer to Galadriel as a king, or they refer to Celeborn as a king. I think I might have said king twice there, but it's sort of incorrect, and they're never corrected simply because Galadriel and Celeborn are too polite to just say hey now, and that's not actually true. So
it is Lady Galadriel. What is the name of the fiery mountain where the One Ring was destroyed?
No, you're kidding. Oh, this one's bad. Okay, so it's not Erebor. Erebor is the Lonely Mountain in Rivanion. It's far to the north of Mordor. It's featured in The Hobbit. That's where Smaug was. The mountain in Mordor where the ring was forged and where the ring was destroyed has many names, and two of them are Mount Doom and Orodruin. Orodruin is an Elvish word that basically means Red Mountain, where Mount Doom is a translation of another Elvish name, Amon Amarth, which means Mount Doom. So yeah. B and C are both correct. Now, I'm interested to see which one the quiz says is correct, but they're the same thing. Very few places in Tolkien's world only have one name. I mean, even Mount Doom, okay. Even the Shire is, that's just the English translation of what the Hobbits called it. The Hobbits called it the Suzat. I mean...
What creature is Gollum's true form?
So Gollum is a hobbit. He's a specific type of hobbit called a Stoor. There are three types of hobbits. They're the Stoors, the Fallowhides, and the Harfoots. He's not a wraith. He's still alive. He's not an elf, obviously. I mean, look at this guy. Yeah, he was a Stoor. He was a Stoor that had lived in a place called the Vales of the Anduin near the Gladden Fields where the ring was lost. And what happened was, at some point, the hobbits were basically nomadic tribes that wandered all over Middle-earth, but at some point they all sort of came together in sort of the central part of Eriador called Bree Land. And that's where they lived. And at one point, some of them wandered out to the western area, and they found this land that they really liked. They called it the Suzat, which translates to the Shire. They went to the king of Arthedain, which was where this land was, because it used to be Arnor, but it was split into 3 realms after there was a succession crisis. So there's Arnor, Cardolan, and Rhudaur. And this was Arthedain. So Arthedain, the king of Arthedain, said, yes, sure, you could have that land, rule it as you will, just as long as you keep the roads clear and upkept and everything. And so they were given that land, and eventually the king died, and he didn't have any heirs. So there was no longer a king in Arnor, in any of the realms of Arnor, and the person who would really become the king was... Well, I mean, he did have an heir, but I guess he chose not to become the king. He chose to become the chieftain of the Dunedain. That way he could sort of be not in government, but in charge of, like, all of Arnor, of the Dunedain at least, which are the noble men from Numenor. Anyway, so the Stores and the Fallowhides and the Harfoots all came to the Shire, or, well, not all of them. Some of them lived in Bree, but there was a group of Stores, not all of the Stores, but there was a group of them that didn't really like this area. And so they removed themselves from it. And the word that Tolkien used was they remigrated back to their point of origin, to the Vales of the Anduin. They became known as the River Folk, and they were essentially the Stores of the Vales of the Anduin, and that's where Gollum was from. Not saying that Gollum himself lived in the Shire, but that he's from a tribe that at one point had lived in the Shire. Some people get the interpretation, and sometimes it's because of the films, or sometimes it's because honestly of the book and not knowing the deeper lore, that they are from a period of time before the Shire. And Gandalf sort of gives this impression when he says that Gollum's people were akin to the fathers of the Stores. He's sort of making it out to say, well, he's not exactly a hobbit, he's not the same as the Stores that live in the Shire, but he's somewhat like, and Tolkien explained that this was Gandalf sort of easing Frodo into the idea that Gollum was a hobbit. Actually, the Shire predates Gollum by a lot. Gollum is about, almost 600 years old in The Lord of the Rings, and that's quite a lot less than the Shire. The Shire was founded 1,600 years prior to that, so there you have it.
He was a Store named Smeagol.
I think we're only going to get through one quiz today.
What is the place where the Ents reside?
So this is interesting because there might be Ents in Mirkwood, but I don't think they find it a wholesome place. Fangorn Forest, which is named after Fangorn, also known as Treebeard, is where we know there are Ents. There were Ents all over Middle-earth once, including in Beleriand and Eriador. There are probably Ents in the Old Forest. There were probably Ents in some of the forests that weren't even visited. Rohan is also technically correct because Fangorn Forest is in Rohan. So, yeah, B and C are both correct, but C is more specific. They should have just had 3 forests.
Fangorn Forest.
It could have said Doriath. Well,
Who is known
they
as
did
the
live in
White Lady
Doriath.
of Rohan?
The White Lady of Rohan is not a term from the books. What? White Lady of Rohan. Yeah, Éowyn is probably the one they're looking for. She is a lady, and she lived in Rohan. She was the king's niece, and after he died, her brother, Éomer, became the king, so then she was the king's sister. But she was also the princess of Ithilien because she married Faramir. Arwen is not from Rohan. Galadriel's not from Rohan. Éowyn's the only one here that's from Rohan. I've never heard her referred as the White Lady. That's not a term from the books, not a term from the movies either. But we know it's Éowyn.
Who says the famous line, "You shall not pass"?
Ian McKellen said the famous line, "You shall not pass." I mean, that's what Gandalf said in the movie. In the book, it was, "You cannot pass." And he does say, "You cannot pass" in the movie. He says it a few times. That's how the speech went. It started with, "You cannot pass," and then he said a little bit more. "I am a wielder of the secret fire. A servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. You cannot pass." He would say, "You cannot pass," and then a little bit of boasting, and then "You cannot pass," and then a little bit of boasting, and then one last time at the end, "You cannot pass," when he slammed his staff down on the bridge of Khazad-dûm, breaking both the staff and the bridge, sending the Balrog down. It was actually Ian McKellen who came up with the idea of the last one being "You shall not pass," which is really cool, I think. Yeah. Gandalf.
It was Gandalf while breaking the bridge of Khazad-dûm. What gift does Lady Galadriel give Gimli before the Fellowship departs Lothlorien?
Oh, man. Oh, my God. Well, two of them are correct, once again. The Mithril Vest, no, she didn't have a Mithril Vest. That was a gift that Bilbo had given to Frodo, and that was in Rivendell, not Lothlorien. She did give him 3 strands of her hair. That is most certainly the answer that they are looking for. I did a whole thing about why she did this and what it meant and the whole symbology behind it in a recent video. But yeah, she also gave him an elven cloak. As a matter of fact, all of the Fellowship were given elven cloaks. And we know that Gimli had an elven cloak because he used it to sort of blend into the surroundings along with Aragorn and Legolas when the Rohirrim rode by them, and they didn't notice them until Aragorn called out to them. Yeah, so technically A and B are correct. I'm sure they're looking for the answer B.
Who is the author of the Lord of the Rings series?
It's in the title of the video. It's right here. This guy. I think it's pronounced Tolkien? James. Wait, I'm trying to get it as wrong as possible. James Randolph Rafe Tolkien. Yeah, no, it's John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. C.S. Lewis was a friend of his. He called him Jack because that was his actual name. He wrote the Narnia books and a bunch of great science fiction. George R.R. Martin is more modern. He wrote a series called The Song of Ice and Fire. But, yeah, The Lord of the Rings was obviously written by Tolkien. If you're taking this quiz and you don't get this one right, you're 33 questions into it, and it was in the title. So how is this for hardcore fans? Pretty weak. I don't think it's getting a passing grade here. I think
What is the name of the powerful
it's not an F yet, but they're not really allies. They're more like enemies that are using each other for personal gain. It's Saruman. Radagast has nothing to do with Sauron. Gandalf is his sworn enemy. Saruman sort of has this idea that he can fool Saruman into believing that he's joined him and then either usurp him and take his place or try to guide Sauron towards being better than he is. Either way, they're not really allies. They're using each other. And Sauron is the one that's more successful at using people.
Which city serves as the capital of Gondor?
Okay, so the answer here is Minas Tirith, which means the Tower of Guard. It used to be called Minas Anor, or the Tower of the Sun. The other tower was Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Moon, but it fell into the hands of the enemy and became known as Minas Morgul, or the Tower of Sorcery. Helm's Deep is not in Gondor. It's part of Rohan, although that used to be part of Rohan, and used to be part of Gondor, and the castle there, the Hornburg, was built by Gondor, but it is now Rohan. And Edoras is also in Rohan. That's the palace of the kings there. That's where Meduseld is. So Minas Tirith is the answer. Now, historically, the capital of Gondor was actually a city called Osgiliath, but it was overrun by the enemy. They were driven back. They had to remove themselves to Minas Tirith. Like I said, having the capital right up against Mordor seemed like a good idea when the Tower of the Moon was between them, but once that fell, Osgiliath was sort of laid bare. They moved the seat of the king and the seat of the steward to Minas Tirith, and when Aragorn took over as king in the Fourth Age, he had Osgiliath restored and rebuilt, but he decided to keep the seat of the king at Minas Tirith and continue to have that be the capital.
It is the famous Minas Tirith. What race does Aragorn belong to?
So he's not a dwarf or an elf. He's got a little bit of elvish heritage going way, way back to a guy named Elros, who was Elrond's brother, who was given the choice of being an elf or a man. He chose to be a man. His parents were also mortals when they were born, Jarundil and Elwing, but they were Perithil, which means half-elf, because they both had elvish parents. So, and they also, given those choices, they both chose to be elves. Dunedain is a singular form of Dunedain. I mentioned that word a few times. Dun refers to Numenor. It refers to the west. And Adan is man. The plural of Adan is Idain. So the plural of Dunedain is Dunedain. So that's what he is. The race is men, but specifically he is a Dunedain. And there's this sort of very amusing thing where Frodo had met him and thought his name was Strider, and then, of course, he told him his name was Aragorn, and they've been traveling together, and he sort of knows that he's Aragorn, he knows that he's Strider, and then he meets Bilbo in Rivendell, and Bilbo keeps going on about, my friend the Dunedain. And then when it's revealed that it's Aragorn, Frodo's like, you have so many names, and Bilbo's like, that's not a name, Dunedain, Dun-Adan, man of the west, from Numenor. I thought I taught you enough Elvish to know that.
What is the name of the river that flows through Rivendell?
A lot of river questions in this. In this case, it's the Bruinen, which is another sort of, this one flows into the Anduin, and the place where they cross the river to get into it is called the Ford of Bruinen. That's the one that's flooded. You know, in the movies, it made it look like Arwen was doing it. In the books, it was actually Elrond doing it with a little bit of help from Gandalf. The Celebrant, as we mentioned, that's the Silver Low that's further south. And the Gwathlow is, yeah, it's sort of in the area, but that's not the right answer. It's Bruinen.
What is the name of the tavern in Bree where the hobbits meet Aragorn?
That's the Prancing Pony. The Golden Perch and the Green Dragon are real places in Middle-earth.
The Prancing Pony.
You know, they wanted to go, some of the hobbits wanted to go to the Green Dragon, but they didn't. So Theoden is not a member of the Fellowship of the Ring. Obviously, he's the king of Rohan. He was in Rohan when the Fellowship was formed. He's a good friend of Merry's. The leader of the Ringwraiths is technically Sauron. Morgoth was not around when they were created. The Witch King of Angmar is sort of the Ringwraith that is their leader, but he answers to Sauron. I'm sure they're looking for the Witch King as the answer, especially considering there is a picture of the Witch King from that infamous scene from the Return of the King film where they got the dialogue right, but everything else wrong. If you haven't ever seen that scene, it's only in the extended cut.
How many did you answer?
Well, I answered all of them. I'm sure everybody answered all of them. They may not have answered correctly, but these are the recommended thing. I understand the Harry Potter thing, but why is would you rather junk food versus healthy food? By the way, I love fried chicken and I love broccoli, but if it came down to it, yeah, I'm picking up fried chicken. Picking up the broccoli as a side. But anyway, yeah, pretty weak. There were too many of them where multiple answers were correct. There was one that was really dirty with Theoden and Éomer both being on there. The Mount Doom Orodruin thing, you know, there were too many issues like that. I guess there was none where the correct answer was completely wrong. So there's that. But there were multiple questions where there were more than one correct answer, and sometimes it was kind of misleading. I would say that I got to give this one a D plus. I'm going to give this quiz a D plus. I think it could have been good. There were a few good questions in there. I take great umbrage with the title of it being the ultimate Lord of the Rings quiz for hardcore J.R.R. Tolkien fans. Because, no, I've definitely seen better quizzes. I've seen better written quizzes. I've seen more thoughtful quizzes. I've seen much more difficult quizzes. This one, it's not a total fail, but it's mostly a failure. Yeah, they didn't do a great job at this one. I wish them good luck in creating quizzes, and hopefully they can maybe create a better Tolkien quiz. But I sort of wish that YouTube still had the option of making a video response. Of course, you could make a video that is a response to another, but you used to be able to actually tell YouTube that you're making this video in response to a specific video, because I would love to upload this video as a response, but that's a feature that's been discontinued a long time ago, I'm sure because it was horribly abused. But either way, I'm definitely going to do more of these. So if you liked it, subscribe for more. And of course, I do also answer all sorts of Tolkien questions, and I do podcasts and such. I'll see you guys next time.